Imagine, if you will, a palace echoing not with the laughter of children, but with the whispers of intrigue and the lingering scent of ambition, and perhaps the faint tang of old blood. Into this gilded cage, a boy was born, hailed as England's savior even before his first cry resonated through the royal chambers. He was the miracle, the long-awaited legitimate son, the answer to a nation's desperate prayers. From the tenderest age, he was told every single day by every whispering courtier and zealous cleric that he was chosen by God himself. Destined, they proclaimed, to purify a broken kingdom, to steer England onto a righteous path, cleansed of the perceived heresies of Rome. And he, in his innocent, fervent youth, believed it with every fiber of his being. This, my friends, is the story of Edward VI, Henry VII's only legitimate son. A child who, at the tender age of 9, ascended to the throne, not as a mere figurehead, but as the living embodiment of a Protestant future, a beacon of hope for those who craved religious reform. But what if the history books, in their neat, sanitized narratives, have overlooked a crucial, chilling truth? What if this boy, so often remembered as a fragile, sickly monarch, too frail for the burdens of power, harbored a darkness far more profound, far more terrifying than any battlefield tyrant, any ruthless conqueror? In the next thrilling 30 minutes, we are going to unearth the story that those dusty textbooks meticulously left behind. Prepare yourselves to discover how a child, molded by a relentless obsession with divine decree and an isolation that bordered on the cruel, very nearly dragged an entire nation into a nightmare of fanaticism. Because Edward didn't just inherit a crown. Oh no. He inherited something far more dangerous, far more potent, a radical, unyielding idea of spiritual purity, of absolute divine authority. And what he did with that idea, the zealous, unyielding path he embarked upon, will irrevocably change the way you look at power wielded by innocent hands, the terrifying zeal of youth, and the devastating, unconscionable cost of unwavering belief. Prepare yourselves, for the curtain is about to rise on a chapter of English history that is as unsettling as it is compelling. Let us begin. When we talk about the Tudor dynasty, the spotlight usually falls on Henry VII's dramatic marriages, Mary's bloody reign, or Elizabeth's golden age. Edward VI, he's often just a footnote, a pale boy king who ruled briefly before vanishing into history. But what if we've been overlooking one of the most disturbing figures of the entire Tudor lineage? Edward wasn't just a sickly child with a short reign. He was the product of royal paranoia, political extremism, and theological obsession. His story isn't one of innocence lost, it's one of innocence twisted. Why has Edward been so forgotten? Perhaps because the truth about his rule is too unsettling. Unlike his sisters, Edward didn't inherit trauma, he inherited unchecked power. And instead of wielding it with caution, he embraced it with chilling resolve. This isn't just history, it's a mirror. Edward's life forces us to ask, what happens when a child believes he's a god? And what happens to a nation when no one dares to say no to a king who hasn't yet learned how to feel? To answer that, we must return to where it all began, at a royal birth that was celebrated like salvation. The 12th of October, 1537. The very air of England hummed with a fervent, almost delirious joy. Across the length and breadth of the kingdom, church bells, those venerable voices of stone and metal, pealed forth with an unbridled jubilation. For at long last, the ravenous hunger of King Henry VII had been satiated. What he had craved more fiercely than any earthly treasure, more desperately than dominion itself, had finally been delivered unto him, a legitimate male heir. The birth of Prince Edward, this precious new life, was hailed not merely as a dynastic triumph, but as a providential sign, the divine answer to decades of royal desperation and the gnawing anxiety of an unstable succession. It was, in the eyes of a nation holding its breath, nothing short of salvation made flesh. Yet, as is so often the cruel decree of fate, the resounding echoes of celebration were destined to be tragically, abruptly silenced. A mere 12 days after the joyous arrival of the longed-for prince, a chilling pall descended upon the royal court. Jane Seymour, Edward's mother and Henry's third, most cherished wife, succumbed to the relentless complications of childbirth. The vibrant tapestry of life so recently woven was torn asunder, leaving behind a void that even royal splendor could not fill. In the grieving eyes of a nation, this sudden, poignant loss did not diminish Edward's significance. Rather, it elevated him to an almost sacred status. He was not just a prince, but a miracle bought at a terrible cost, a living testament to his mother's sacrifice. And in the grief-stricken gaze of his father, the formidable Henry VIII, Edward became more than precious. He became sacred, a divine trust, an inviolable emblem of his very legacy. Thus, this child, this infant prince, was raised not by the tender hand of a mother, but within an impenetrable cocoon of royal protection and an almost worshipful reverence. He was shielded from the harsh realities of the world, bathed in an atmosphere where his very existence was equated with the survival of a dynasty, the continuation of a divine plan. He was not merely a child. He was the consecrated vessel through which Henry's monumental, often brutal, legacy would endure. Such an unbearable weight of expectation, enough to shatter the spirit of any ordinary mortal, did not, it seems, break Edward. Instead, it meticulously, perhaps inevitably, molded the very contours of his young soul. Every tentative step he took, every fledgling word he uttered was meticulously observed, meticulously interpreted, and framed not as the simple development of a growing boy, but as an undeniable sign of divine destiny. There were no gentle lullabies to soothe him to sleep, no whimsical bedtime stories to ignite his imagination. Instead, his formative years were saturated with the solemn pronouncements of Scripture, the rigid tenets of doctrine, and the ceaseless, suffocating reminder that he was born not merely to rule a kingdom, but to redeem it. Imagine, if you dare, the profound, distorting weight of such a childhood. The chilling realization that your birth, a moment of profound joy, was ultimately celebrated more ardently, more lastingly than your mother's very life. For Edward, this early, devastating loss did not translate into a profound, empathetic grief as it might for others. Oh no. From this crucible of tragedy and ultimate triumph, a chilling sense of entitlement was forged within him. And that seed of destiny, planted so young, nurtured in an environment where no one dared to question his divine right, would, we shall see, burgeon into something far more dangerous, far more terrifying than any mortal could have ever predicted. The stage, my friends, was set for a reign that would challenge the very notion of what it means to be king and what it means to be human. Henry VIII. The very name conjures a gallery of conflicting images. The ruthless tyrant, the ardent reformer who dared to challenge Rome, the capricious romantic, the chilling executioner who sent wives and ministers alike to the block. Yet beneath these multifaceted personas, there lay a profound, consuming obsession that shaped his every action: legacy. And after the crushing blows of losing two sons in their fragile infancy, Edward, his only legitimate male heir, became more than mere succession. He became, in the king's distorted vision, Henry's very redemption. Unlike his daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, who experienced the brutal ebb and flow of royal favor, alternately banished, neglected, or ruthlessly manipulated as political pawns, Edward was bathed in an unyielding, almost suffocating adoration. Henry lavished upon him the finest tutors, men of unparalleled intellect and devotion, and adorned him with the grandest, most exquisite gifts imaginable. But far more insidious than any material indulgence was the gift of absolute, unwavering attention. For most children, a father's love is a sanctuary, a source of warmth and unwavering safety. It is a soft embrace, a comforting presence in a bewildering world. But when that father is Henry VIII, that love, warped by his own colossal ego and divine self-perception, could feel less like affection and more like worship. Edward wasn't simply told he was loved. He was meticulously, relentlessly told he was destined. This subtle yet profound distinction, this indoctrination into a sense of divine right, would irrevocably shape the boy's mind in ways that were nothing short of chilling. Every lesson he received, every interaction he had served to reinforce his inherent superiority. His prodigious intellect, lauded by his tutors, was not seen as a gift to be honed, but as irrefutable proof of his chosen status. Every childish mistake, every youthful indiscretion was not met with gentle correction, but with a blind excuse dismissed as a mere trifling burden of the greatness that awaited him. Edward grew up in an echo chamber of adulation, never being challenged, never once being contradicted. To question his judgment, his burgeoning opinions, or even his childish whims was to question the very will of God himself. And so, steeped in an environment of absolute deference, no one dared to. This relentless, unwavering devotion, this cultivation of an almost messianic self-image, did not, contrary to what one might expect, foster a grateful or humble son. Instead, it forged a boy king who truly believed that his fleeting emotions were immutable laws, that his fervent, often rigid beliefs were unassailable truths. In that gilded cradle of Tudor power, surrounded by the intoxicating perfume of flattery and the ever-present chill of fear, Edward began to internalize a terrifying notion: that the entire world, with all its complexities and contradictions, existed for one singular purpose: to fulfill his divinely inspired vision. And when you bestow upon a child, a nascent human spirit still forming its understanding of the world, unlimited power without the crucial tempering of boundaries, without the essential lessons of humility and empathy, what you invariably unleash is not a leader. What you get instead is a force of nature, a storm. A storm, my dear listeners, that was soon, very soon, to be unleashed upon the unsuspecting realm of England. The clouds were gathering, and the thunder, though yet distant, was becoming discernible. And what will England do when faced with a storm born not of nature, but of unchecked divine belief in a child's heart? You will want to know. From the opulent confines of the Tudor court to the eager eyes of the European powers, Edward's education was, without question, heralded as nothing short of a triumph. Indeed, the boy prince was a prodigy, a beacon of intellect that shone brilliantly even in his tender years. He could engage in sophisticated debates in fluent Latin before his 8th birthday, his sharp mind capable of quoting Aristotle from memory, and his precocious hand penned theological essays that reportedly left seasoned university professors in stunned admiration. He was, by all outward appearances, the very embodiment of the Renaissance ideal, a scholar prince destined for enlightened rule. But beneath this glittering veneer of intellectual brilliance, a darker, more insidious truth lay coiled, a truth that would ultimately cast a long and terrifying shadow over his brief reign. For his tutors, those learned men entrusted with shaping the mind of England's future king, were far from neutral scholars. They were, in fact, radical Protestant reformers, meticulously handpicked by Henry VIII himself to cultivate not merely a monarch, but a perfect Protestant monarch. Their mission was not to foster independent thought, to encourage critical inquiry, or to expand the boundless horizons of a child's imagination. Oh no, their explicit, unwavering purpose was to instruct Edward what to think, and perhaps more dangerously what to fear. From the first glimmer of dawn until the fading light of dusk, every lesson, every conversation, every moment of his rigorous education was utterly steeped in a singular, uncompromising ideology. Catholicism, the faith that had defined England for centuries, was not merely presented as incorrect or misguided. It was branded as irredeemably evil, a festering malignancy to be excised from the very soul of the nation. Any form of opposition, any deviation from the newly forged Anglican path, was not characterized as mere disagreement or legitimate dissent. It was unequivocally condemned as a grievous sin, a betrayal of God's divine will. Every subject, from the sweeping narratives of history to the intricacies of political theory, even down to the fundamental rules of grammar, was filtered, distilled, and presented through the narrow, unyielding lens of divine absolutism and radical Protestant doctrine. John Cheek, his chief tutor, a man of profound learning and even more profound conviction, once penned a chilling testament to his pedagogical goals. He wrote with an almost prophetic certainty that Edward would become a sword in the Lord's hand. And this, my friends, is precisely how the boy king began to perceive himself. Not as a future monarch, bound by the duties and responsibilities of governance, but as a consecrated divine weapon. Not as a humble servant of his people, tasked with their welfare and prosperity, but as a ruthless purifier of their souls, a cleanser of spiritual impurity. But I ask you, my discerning audience, what happens when you place a sharpened sword into the hand of a child, and far worse, teach him that mercy, that compassion, is not a virtue but a debilitating weakness? Edward's brilliant, yet tragically molded, mind became not a vibrant forum for creative thought, but a rigid cathedral of unyielding doctrine, and, concurrently, a desolate dungeon for empathy. His personal notebooks, those intimate windows into the burgeoning thoughts of a young mind, were not filled with the nascent verses of poetry, nor the imaginative sketches of a dreaming child. Instead, they were meticulously filled with cold, relentless arguments, meticulously justifying violence, even bloodshed, in the name of spiritual purity. He was not, in essence, being trained for the complex, nuanced art of governance, of leading a diverse populace. He was being relentlessly trained for war, a holy war against perceived heresy. And as Edward's formidable intellect sharpened, so too did his terrifying certainty. Within the confines of his meticulously cultivated world, there was no room for questions, no space for doubt, no quarter for the complexities of human experience. There was only absolute righteousness, and the chilling, unyielding power to impose it upon a kingdom that awaited his rule. What will happen, then, when such a precise, unfeeling weapon is finally unsheathed and turned upon the very people it was meant to protect? The answer, I assure you, is a tale that will haunt you long after the telling. My friends, consider for a moment the typical concerns that occupy the mind of a 9-year-old. Perhaps the daily trials of school, the joyful camaraderie or fleeting squabbles of friendships, or the eager anticipation of the next game to be played. These are the innocent preoccupations of childhood, universal across centuries. But Edward, at the tender age of 9, was not handed a new toy or a lighter burden. He was handed a kingdom. When the colossal figure of Henry VIII finally departed this mortal coil in 1547, the mantle of monarchy fell upon the slender shoulders of his precocious son. Edward ascended to the throne of a nation not unified and prosperous, but fractured, bleeding from the deep wounds of religious strife, riddled with political mistrust, and simmering with profound social unrest. And into this tumultuous storm, this whirlpool of national anxiety, stepped a mere boy, one who had been raised in splendid isolation, yet was utterly convinced, with an unwavering and terrifying certainty, that he spoke for God himself. The seasoned adults who surrounded him, the power brokers of the court, harbored a collective, unspoken hope. They believed they could govern through him, guiding the inexperienced hand of the child king. A regency council was swiftly formed, headed by his uncle, the ambitious and influential Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset. But these seasoned politicians, these architects of power, made a fatal miscalculation. They utterly underestimated how profoundly, how irrevocably, Edward had internalized his own divine authority. From the very outset of his reign, even before the ink was truly dry on his father's will, the boy king pushed back against their cautious counsel. He corrected his seasoned advisers during council meetings, his young voice cutting through the hushed chamber with an almost disarming confidence. He would, with startling precision, recite passages of scripture from memory to challenge their carefully considered decisions, turning their own religious fervor against them. And when they, in their worldly wisdom, advised caution, compromise, or prudence, he would, with the terrifying conviction of the truly devout, accuse them not merely of political misjudgment, but of betraying Christ himself. This was not simply the arrogance of a privileged child, a fleeting display of youthful insolence. No, this was something far more deeply ingrained, far more rigid. It was doctrine. Edward did not perceive his rule as conditional, a collaboration with his council, or a responsibility to be shared. He saw it as sacred, a direct mandate from the Almighty. And if others dared to disagree, if they questioned his pronouncements or hesitated to implement his will, they were not merely wrong in their political calculations. They were, in his fervent eyes, enemies of God, impediments to his divine plan. This was not the petulant wail of a child throwing a tantrum. This was the terrifying display of a prodigy of zealotry, a young mind wielding his formidable education with chilling precision to silence dissent, to crush opposition. Within mere weeks of his ascension, the boy king was personally reviewing death warrants, his precocious intellect dissecting legal texts with a detached efficiency. Within months, he was dictating sermons to his compliant clergy, sermons that promised swift and eternal damnation for any compromise with the perceived forces of popery or any softening of the new religious reforms. And the chilling truth, the truly terrifying reality, was that no one dared to stop him. And so, the child who could barely lift a heavy sword, the boy who would never personally lead an army into battle, began wielding the pen with a precision that was deadly, a purpose that was absolute. He was not merely signing documents. He was writing laws that reshaped the fabric of society, signing execution orders that extinguished lives, and irrevocably reshaping England not as a mere kingdom of men, but as his own personal altar, a purified realm consecrated to his singular vision of God. The boy was no longer learning how to rule. He was already ruling. And the consequences of such absolute power, wielded by a mind so brilliant yet so devoid of human empathy, so consumed by divine certainty, would be nothing less than devastating for England. The storm born in that golden cradle, nurtured by doctrine and unleashed by a child king, was about to break in full fury, and the very foundations of the realm would tremble. What terrifying decrees would issue from such a heart? What brutal reforms would be enacted by such a hand? The answers, I assure you, are far more harrowing than you could possibly imagine. To Edward, the very concept of faith was not, as it might be for so many, a comforting balm for the soul, a gentle refuge in a tumultuous world. No. For Edward, faith was a vast and uncompromising battlefield, and he, the boy king, was utterly, fanatically determined to emerge victorious, no matter the cost. Most rulers of his turbulent era, even those with strong personal convictions, understood the delicate dance between diplomacy and belief. They navigated the shifting currents of religious loyalty with a pragmatic eye, balancing the needs of state with the dictates of conscience. Not so Edward. He saw every subtle hint of Catholic tradition, every lingering shadow of the old faith, as not merely a deviation, but as a profound betrayal of his divine mandate. Every whispered Latin prayer, every forbidden rosary bead, every illicit mass celebrated in secret, each was, in his young, unyielding mind, a corrosive crack in the very foundation of his nascent Protestant vision for England. And he was not content with mere reform. Oh no, Edward yearned to purge. Under his increasingly rigid rule, England began to transform into a surveillance state in miniature, a chilling precursor to later totalitarian regimes. Laws were issued with swift and uncompromising severity, mandating strict church attendance, outlawing cherished Catholic rites, and punishing, with startling cruelty, even private prayer that dared not fit his meticulously crafted Protestant mold. Neighbors were not merely encouraged, but actively incentivized to spy upon neighbors, their loyalties fractured by fear and suspicion. Most disturbingly, children, innocent and malleable, were rewarded for the insidious act of reporting their own parents, transforming familial bonds into potential snares of accusation. This was not governance, not the steady hand of a monarch guiding his people. This was inquisition, cold and systematic, clothed in the vestments of divine righteousness. Yet perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this burgeoning system of oppression was not the architecture of its enforcement, but the chilling relish with which Edward himself embraced it. Court records, those dispassionate chroniclers of history, reveal a boy king who did not merely approve of punishments. He consistently intensified them. He would personally pore over reports of suspected heresy, his brilliant mind dissecting the details with a detached intellectual curiosity. He would suggest harsher penalties, his youthful imagination conjuring ever more ingenious forms of public humiliation. Consider the fate of one unfortunate priest, his spirit broken, who was forced to march through the bustling streets of London, adorned with a sign that proclaimed him an enemy of Christ, while jeering children, encouraged by the very authorities, hurled stones and refused at his cowering form. This, my friends, was not the spontaneous outburst of an angry mob, but the meticulously orchestrated humiliation conceived in the mind of the boy king himself. And it is said with a shiver-inducing certainty that Edward watched these spectacles unfold from his palace window, his young features alight, a chilling laugh escaping his lips. This was not policy born of political necessity or pragmatic governance. This was cruelty, unadulterated and potent, meticulously wrapped in the sanctimonious cloak of righteousness. Religious purity was not merely a lofty goal. It was an all-consuming obsession, a burning crucible in which all other human considerations were incinerated. And Edward, armed with the unassailable certainty of Scripture and the terrifying weight of unchecked authority, had come to believe with every fiber of his being that mercy itself was a sin, a weakness that would compromise his divine mission. The child who, by birthright and intellect, could have been a unifying force, a beacon of reconciliation in a divided land, had instead transformed himself into a relentless judge, a pitiless jury, and a chillingly effective executioner for an entire faith. And believe me, his war against Catholicism, against the old ways, against the very human spirit that resisted his rigid vision, was just getting started. What fresh horrors would this divine child unleash upon his kingdom? The next chapter, I promise you, will reveal the terrifying answer. For most children, the very concept of family is a sanctuary, a foundational source of unwavering love, an unwavering embrace of safety, and a comforting tapestry of shared memories. But for Edward VI, the boy king, family was something entirely different. It was a treacherous landscape of potential threats, a volatile force to be meticulously managed, or, if deemed necessary, ruthlessly eliminated. His half-sister Mary, the eldest of Henry VII's surviving children, was a woman of fervent, unwavering Catholic devotion. To Edward, this did not simply make her misguided or wrong. It rendered her profoundly dangerous, a living embodiment of the very heresy he was divinely ordained to eradicate. He did not see her as blood, as a sibling with whom he shared a lineage. He saw her as heresy incarnate, a walking affront to his sacred mission. In his private writings, stark and chilling in their clarity, he referred to her with disdain as the bastard, and with a chilling religious fervor as Christ's enemy, words laced not merely with ideological conviction, but with a palpable, corrosive hatred that defied familial bonds. His zealotry was terrifyingly practical. He meticulously drafted intricate legal arguments, calculated to strip her of her rightful succession rights, ensuring that his Protestant vision would remain untainted. He even went so far as to imagine her public confession of guilt, to orchestrate her humiliation. And, in a macabre display of his cold precision, He personally designed her execution down to the method, beheading a swift and merciful death, rather than the agonizing flames of the pyre, but only if she repented her papist ways. This was no mere political maneuvering, no calculated chess move on the grand board of statecraft. This was obsession, pure and unadulterated, born of a mind convinced of its divine prerogative. And what of Elizabeth, his other half-sister? Though she shrewdly shared his Protestant beliefs, aligning herself with the prevailing winds of reform, Edward viewed her less as a cherished sibling and more as a convenient political pawn. He meticulously planned to marry her off to secure advantageous alliances with foreign powers, treating her entire future not as a life to be lived, but as a cold transactional exchange, a means to an end in his grand strategic design. Even his own uncle, Thomas Seymour, a man of soaring ambition and fleeting charm, was not spared the chilling detachment of the boy king. When Seymour attempted to curry favor, to gain influence with lavish gifts and carefully cultivated affection, Edward responded not with the natural warmth of a nephew, but with a profound and ingrained suspicion. When Seymour was ultimately arrested for treason, accused of plotting against the Regency Council, Edward's support for his execution was unwavering. He witnessed the grim spectacle from a palace window, watching the very uncle who had once shared moments of his childhood ascend the scaffold, his young face devoid of any discernible emotion. The boy who had once shared fleeting childhood moments, perhaps even a nascent bond with his sisters, had become utterly incapable of genuine human connection. In his meticulously ordered world, everyone around him was reduced to a simple binary, either a useful tool for the advancement of his divine vision or a dangerous threat to its realization. In Edward's meticulously controlled court, love had no place, no currency. Loyalty was conditional, constantly weighed against the scales of religious purity and personal utility. And the bonds of blood, those ancient, sacred ties that had long governed the actions of kings and commoners alike, were rendered utterly irrelevant, mere inconvenient fictions in the face of his divine certainty. Family, that most intimate of human institutions, had thus become just another stark battlefield in the relentless, uncompromising war for religious control that raged within the mind of the boy king. And as his reign progressed, the question loomed cold and terrifying. Who or what would be next to fall before the righteous sword of Edward VI? The full horror of his reign, I assure you, was yet to be fully revealed. Long before Orwell imagined Big Brother, Edward VI had already built a system that watched, listened, and punished. England under Edward became a nation of whisperers. His laws didn't just target public worship, they invaded private life. He dictated how people should pray in their own homes, what they should believe in their hearts, and even how they should think about God. It wasn't just oppressive, it was total. He personally reviewed religious cases, often demanding harsher punishments than what his advisors recommended. He created incentives for citizens to denounce their neighbors, rewards, promotions, favor at court. Children were praised for reporting their parents. Loyalty to family became a liability. The accused weren't tried in open courts. Many were interrogated behind closed doors, punished not for actions but for thoughts. A whispered prayer, a hidden relic, a private doubt, all could be fatal. What's more chilling, Edward loved it. His journals from this time read more like manuals than diaries, detailed notes on which punishments worked best, ideas for public humiliations, and critiques on the effectiveness of pain. There was no remorse, only cold, methodical precision, and all of it was cloaked in divine language. He wasn't punishing sinners, he was purifying England. To him, torture was a form of salvation. Edward didn't just rule with fear, he engineered it. And in doing so, he laid the blueprint for religious authoritarianism that would haunt England long after his death. A boy had turned a kingdom into a prison, and the cell doors were closing fast. In early 1553, Edward fell ill. What began as a minor cough soon turned into a wasting disease. His skin yellowed, his hair fell out. His body, once praised as regal, began to decay before the eyes of a horrified court. The diagnosis, likely tuberculosis compounded by arsenic poisoning, ironically administered by his own physicians in a misguided attempt to save him. The boy who had poisoned England with religious tyranny was now being poisoned himself. But Edward didn't soften, he didn't reflect. He doubled down. In fevered states, he delivered sermons from his bed, urging the mass execution of Catholics. He obsessed over succession, desperate to block Mary's rise. In secret meetings, he plotted a coup to install his Protestant cousin, Lady Jane Grey, bypassing both his sisters. These weren't the delusions of a dying boy. They were organized, intentional, and chillingly precise. He drafted lists of Catholics to be executed, wrote laws he'd never live to see enforced, even dictated Mary's confession, planning to force her to renounce her faith before her beheading. And as his body rotted, he remained lucid, aware of his suffering, yet unmoved by it. Witnesses described him ranting in agony, still cursing Mary, still demanding purity, even as his own flesh betrayed him. Edward's final hours were grotesque. His skin turned